And we're kicking off our first session today with the topic, What is Changing? The Loss of Observation and Rise of Experimentation. Our guests today are Chris Comstock and Nate Woodman. Chris is the Chief Product Officer here at Clarivine, and he has over 15 years of experience in digital marketing and data management fields. He's worked as a consultant, brand and product leader for a variety of top companies, and in his current role, he heads Clarivine's product vision. Nate Woodman is an ad tech industry leader and measurement expert. He's the founder of Proof, a consultancy that helps clients plan and deploy measurement and optimization solutions that address the anonymous web. Throughout his career in advertising and technology, Nate has worked across ad tech startups, consulting, and advertising companies. Today, they'll be going through a Q&A style discussion, answering questions related to what is changing in metadata management and what this means for the future. We're also happy to answer any questions you may have, as well as hear your thoughts on the questions asked during this discussion. So please leave them in the comment section here. And with that, I will pass it over to Chris and Nate.
All right, thanks, Casey. And thanks for joining everyone today. Nate and I really want to we've been talking about end-to-end measurement as it relates to metadata, the changes in the industry. And we've been talking about them, amongst ourselves for probably 3 or 4 months now, and really wanted to take those conversations and share them with everyone here today. So, thank you for joining, and really wanted to start, and then I'll hand it over to Nate, really around, why the urgency and what is causing this change in the industry for the last 15 years. And this is what we've talked about a number of times. What's causing the urgency and the change right now? And what do you see kind of happening from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks for having me here too, everybody. I think we all know that, or people that watch the industry closely have known that, kind of targeting, tracking, and measurement has been at risk for many years now. I think if we can trace this back to when kind of Apple started talking about ITP, which, Chris has told me was as early as 2013. But we started people watching the industry closely, kind of 2017, it's about 2019, I think is the year, a couple of years ago, where we started looking at and saying, hey, you can't do the same things in Safari now that you can do in Chrome, right? The tracking and the measurement is changing. But for a whole bunch of years, it was able to hide below the surface. And, if you were running a performance campaign, for an example, you didn't necessarily see the net impact of not being able to track somebody, say, in Mozilla environments or Safari environments, because there was enough room to move, right? Would say the algorithm, the trader could kind of make the performance of the campaign look okay, even though they were missing tracking in those operating systems in those browsers. And what's happened recently is that the order of magnitude, right, of what is being able to be tracked, on the internet has changed very significantly with the rollout of, Apple's app. Right. And we see this recently kind of affects Snap's, kind of like earnings. And it's gotten to the point that you can't hide it anymore. Right. So now the order of magnitude of the urgency to address the problem is really at critical mass. And I think because people have known that they've been, trying to, that they needed to address this for years, there's enough groundswell, kind of in the industry at the moment where, people are starting to realize that they probably should have been working on it for the last couple of years, but they can't ignore it anymore, right? And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned how far back. I think back to even the do not track headers, right? Like that was however long ago in Internet Explorer, and it really came down to market share, right? Internet Explorer people moved away from, and I think what you touched on, that the changes with Apple now, it's overnight. An iOS 15 update caused the entire industry to have to change and lose attribution, which people weren't prepared for.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, and Google, I know, pushed back their changes, but what is it about the change with Apple? And I guess I touched a little bit on the instant overnight update that kind of, now is impacting Snap. It made its way into the earnings calls, which really happened, 6 months ago. We're just kind of seeing the revenue impact now. But what is it that you're seeing that's kind of disrupting it related to their changes, and really attribution, I guess, with Facebook and others?
Yeah. So I even want to come back to a little bit. If you look at attribution in general, right? Attribution was born with digital advertising. about 15 years ago. And it was largely, if you talk to some of the people that have been around for a long time, when DoubleClick started its ad network, right, they needed a way to try to say, well, which publisher do I pay for a performance campaign? And that's where attribution comes from, right? It's not really a sound measurement methodology. It's, it's more in line with like, okay, I am being forced to distribute credit to a supplier. Therefore, I need to some level of attribution. So the digital ad industry has grown up on attribution. Kind of, you'd say last click attribution was probably invented in DoubleClick. It was taken over mostly by Google, right? Kind of like with the advent of search. You see a movement to MTA, right? But it's kind of all based on this premise that you need to observe, right, the ad exposure to a specific user, and then you need to observe the conversion event, right? And there is a methodology of observation, and that has exists within digital advertising. There's all that most people that grew up in digital advertising, me being one, is all you've ever known, right? But if you start broadening, kind of that look and that focus, and you go back to classic and traditional marketing effectiveness research, it wasn't based on observation, right? It was based on experimentation, right? Which is a fundamentally very different approach to how to handle, right? To how to handle credit distribution and effectiveness measurement. And so I think where we are today, right, is that the old is new again. Is that we've grown up on attribution, right? It's still, attribution still might have some value, but nobody that is a digital ad industry native is really well tuned to understand what experimentation is and what experimentation is about. Anybody in a media agency has done some experimentation. It's usually ad hoc. It's usually spot. It's usually is this creative, effective according to a focus group. Maybe at some point they did a market holdout, to test kind of like some type of effectiveness. Experimentation is usually done ad hoc, and it's every time you talk about experimentation to someone in analytics, they're like, experimentation's hard, right? And the reason it's hard is because all the work of experimentation is in the design, in the setup, right? If you screw anything up in the design, the setup to execution, your experiment's contaminated, right? So I think that the difference here is observation is the methodology is usually about what happened, and you observe, from a point in time of an effectiveness event like a conversion, and you look backwards, right? Experimentation is all the work's upfront in making sure that it's executed well throughout so by the time you get the results back, that they're sound and that you can do some work. But there's two methodologies kind of at play here. And I think what we're witnessing now is the loss of observation, and which I think would naturally lead analytics and marketing effectiveness people to look at the experimentation, and hopefully always on experimentation at scale, as an acceptable methodology that doesn't need observation.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about experimentation. I feel like A/B testing, landing page optimization, like everyone's comfortable with that. I think it's because it's easy and it's controlled. By controlled, meaning it's on your own website, right? It's easy to turn on. It's easy to control the variables, look at results because it's your website and it's your own property. You touched on the hard part, doing it in paid media channels and platforms you don't control. Require how many different teams, right? Like what CRM audience are you using? What is the consistency? You've got multiple teams sometimes managing, your Facebook ads and your Facebook audiences is different potentially than search, right? And so how do you coordinate and make sure there is no contamination in the experimentation? So I think it's just an interesting, people are comfortable with A/B testing and, Optimizely tools, and everyone has that tool or a tool like that, but it seems like it's never made its way at scale into kind of paid acquisition channels, if you will.
Right. So it's a methodology that's very well known, right? It's just seems to be inconsistency by channel, right? To where it's applied and where it's used. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So in regards to the changes, I think you touched a little bit on them, but like, where do you see, like, what is that future? I know you mentioned experimentation, but what does that look like for a brand or for agencies that are trying to move in that direction?
Yeah. So, I think just to restate, if you look about the focus of the work, right? It moves from, it moves from the observation, which is what happened after the fact, right? And most of the focus has, in analytics has been on BI, business intelligence reporting, right? And using that reporting output to handle optimization, right? And that's, that's been the focus of the industry because they've thought about the outputs and they've thought about the, the observation. I think the shift in focus needs to go back to the inputs. Focus on the inputs, making sure that you have, kind of scientific engineering grade QA, right? At the point in time that you're handling those inputs. It's very important in order to get, kind of cohesion amongst your different business units or your social media team versus your programmatic team to handle taxonomy management, right, between the two, and enforcing, kind of through QA and experimental design, that taxonomy and the process of setting up, individual campaigns. And quite frankly, that's where we talk about Claravine. Right. It's like, that's kind of like when I was like, realized that this was a problem and I eventually discovered what Claravine does. I was like, oh, it can definitely be used for this. This is every agency in their ad operations process or their marketing operations process has attempted to do something like this. But when you start bringing it outside of the agency and say it's not just about, the programmatic, and the social cohesion and coordination, it's about coordinating agency 1 versus agency 2 versus agency 3. It's about coordinating for an enterprise brand, product SKU 1 versus 2 in country 3 versus 4, right? And so all of a sudden the problem gets a lot more bigger, right? And in my view, you start needing, kind of engineering grade software to be able to handle that process so that you can effectively execute experimentation at scale.
Yeah, you talked about coordination. Sometimes I refer to it as collaboration. Like, I don't think people understand the need for that collaboration on the inputs, the data requirements across those different teams and different markets. And not just that, it's how do you connect back to the data science team or the team who historically has taken a bunch of log files in ETL where you had user level data. And I think you could, right, ad tech and the industry, we just chased users, right? Or you sent an audience over and everything was kind of self-contained in that and optimized around the user.
Yeah.
And that's, like Ads Data Hub has gone away, right? Like you can do aggregate and you still get performance data, but how do you connect that? And I think this is important for a lot of the brands. You still want to connect it back to first party data, right? Like it's not just about doing a test and paid media, but it's like what's working to impact, I always say, revenue. And for us, it's, we end up solving, while in enterprise technology, it's solving more of a people and data problem with that collaboration to help control those inputs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's an important point. Like you started that off with kind of like what does data science do, right?
Yep.
And there's definitely a loss of precision when you don't have the log level data, right? And you don't have the the individual IDs. But fundamentally, but there's a loss of precision, but there's also a gain in breadth. Right. So when you've been precise within, say, your Adobe Analytics implementation, or you've been precise in your search, kind of marketing, you've had, some of that log level data from the click stream, you have a tendency, I think a brand would have a tendency to kind of succumb to something called that I've called the GPS effect, right? Everybody is looking within their channel or silo at the, output and the metrics, of that individual channel, right? Which, okay, that's fine. You can optimize that channel, but a lot of times the metrics in channel 1 don't even correlate with the metrics in channel 2. So it's kind of like each channel is kind of fighting with each other. And when you start thinking, about, kind of like, well, I don't think the loss of the precision is necessarily a bad thing if I gain breadth, right? And start having a holistic understanding of kind of effectiveness in, kind of in larger chunks as opposed to individual ID level precision. I think it's better for marketing effectiveness in general.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good transition. What we're going to talk about in the next session is really around how do you shift and organize that data to prepare for using aggregate data, right? And trusting, like that's kind of what we're going to talk about in the next session is, how do you organize and set up that end-to-end measurement to shift from that precision to, where measurement's going. So
yeah. So I to wrap this, I think that I think we're on the cusp of an opportunity, right, to really nail marketing effectiveness compared to I think we've been a little bit too focused, kind of on the individual channel, the individual silo, the IDs, right, and the kind of the attribution, tracking, and measurement. And I think this opportunity to step back and rethink how we approach it is I think it creates a huge opportunity to make marketing more effective.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yeah, and it's refreshing. It's a good, like, it's not just a new tool. It's actually having to take a step back and rethink how we tackle some of these problems.
yeah, agreed.
All right, thank you to Chris and Nate for giving us some background on the current landscape of metadata changes and what this looks like going forward. So again, we would love to hear your thoughts and questions on this topic. So feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for tuning in and see you next week.